talked about it a lot at work and said things to my team like, "Do you think I should tell everyone that they're in the quadrant of low certainty and low control?" And they said, "We don't think you should actually tell them that explicitly. We think you should just operate from that understanding." So I'm going to kick us off with a few questions to Peter and have a conversation with him, and then we're going to invite all of you to weigh in and ask Peter to speak to your specific questions. So Peter, it's possible that some of the people on this call have not yet had a chance to read your book. So I'm excited to see that one of the black squares on Zoom is called MAP, because if only there were one called Confidence, then we would almost have your entire title on Zoom. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, first of all, about why a map and what is a map?
Yeah, so I realized that as I was teaching my Col 150 class, that real life moves us around. And I needed a way to help my students visualize not just that changes in how we feel change our feelings, but also create clear patterns in decision making, that we do certain kinds of things only when we feel a specific way. And so to get to that point, I had to decide what we really mean when we talk about confidence in the first place, because it's one of those words that we know it when we see it, but we don't always have a good way of describing it. And what I concluded was that confidence requires that we have a sense of certainty, that we know what's coming, that things feel predictable to us, and that we have a sense of control, that we somehow feel prepared, equipped, trained, rehearsed for what's coming. And those two dynamics enabled me to create this very simple 2x2 framework where we have certainty across the x-axis, control across the y-axis, and boxes that then represent these 4 boxes where we have a mix of certainty and control. And by positioning it that way, students could quickly see that their feelings and their actions changed depending on where they were in terms of their location on the map.
Excellent, thank you. And so I have to ask you this next question, which, you know, is probably based on a stereotype of what economists are like, so I apologize in advance for that. But how does a person move from being an economist and a person who works in financial services, who many people think of as, you know, really focused on numbers, you know, not necessarily so interested in the emotional side of life? How did you make that transition from a numbers person to a person who is writing about feelings? You know, to me, it seems slightly counterintuitive, and so I'm really interested to hear how that happened.
Yeah, it wasn't an obvious journey. You know, during the financial crisis, it was all about the numbers. And so you could watch as banks and investment banks failed, but it was clear that the crowd dynamic was affecting the choices that individuals, organizations, policymakers were undertaking. And as much as I had worked in the industry, I hadn't really paid much attention to investor sentiment and investor mood. And so coming out of the financial crisis, I started to look at the relationship between investor sentiment, which is something that is regularly measured, and the markets. And that then led me to think more broadly about sentiment and its impact on what we do in politics, in economic choices, in cultural choices. So that's sort of what led me in that direction.
And well, I was going to deviate off from what I was planning to ask you, and I'm going to just deviate. I think this is a conversation. You know, a lot of your book is about how, you know, it's a book for managers in part. It's about how you move people around on the map. and we'll talk later about why you might want to. But I am interested in the question of whether we can, whether and how we impact feeling in that aggregate. You know, you talk about investor sentiment. How can you intervene in sentiment and shift it on that macro level?
Well,
Maybe.
you see sentiment being impacted on a daily basis. You know, a major news event suddenly shifts
Ah.
our mood. You know, this morning CPI figure all of a sudden sent investors into, you know, wanting to buy bonds and stocks and sell the dollar. And so there's a lot of interplay between what we're hearing and what we're doing. But even there, it has a lot to do with our expectations. So typically when news events are affirming, we don't pay much attention to them. It's only when they startle us that we suddenly change our position, and that then changes the kinds of decisions that we're making and the stories we're telling as a result.
And let me just ask you, do you mind telling our audience what the 4 quadrants are? Because I've realized I'm going to want to refer to them, and it may be helpful for them. Because what I was going to say when you were just speaking was, so essentially, if you're in a particular quadrant and what's around you is confirming the feeling that you have, that's the reason why you're in this quadrant, things are going to be less meaningful to you unless they disrupt whatever feeling state you're in. But then I realized, oh, but maybe they don't know what the quadrants are. So can you just tell them?
Sure. So let me give a quick tour.
Yeah.
So as I said earlier, we have certainty and control. Certainty on the x-axis, control on the y-axis. The upper right-hand box, where we have high certainty, high control, is what I call our comfort zone. It's where things are easy, particularly cognitively, and we tend to be our nicest people. Time moves quickly. There are lots of characteristics to that box that make it particularly enjoyable to us. And, you know, when we talk about getting out of our comfort zone, it's truly introducing uncertainty or a sense of powerlessness in what we do. The lower left-hand box isn't one we enjoy at all. That's where we have very little certainty and very little control. That I call the stress center, because we're always anxious in that box. Something doesn't feel right. There's a problem to be solved. And if you've been in the stress center, you know time moves slowly, and we're not terribly nice, not to others, not to ourselves. And if you've ever experienced a traumatic event, that tends to be in the very lower left-hand corner. And the causes are many, but the experience always puts us in that spot in the lower left-hand corner. So those are the two big boxes, and those tend to be the ones that we think about most when we talk about confidence. But there are two others, and these are hybrid environments that I think are fascinating. One is the lower right-hand box, where we have certainty but no control. I call that the passenger seat because if you've been on an airplane or in the passenger seat of a car, that's exactly the experience. And it's one that can go from being very pleasant and calm to being traumatic in a moment. You know, if you've taught your teenage children to drive, you know that environment can change very quickly. The passenger seat is also in the lower right-hand corner. It's an environment of a maximum security prison, and so we can often feel very trapped in the passenger seat when we don't want to be there. Last box is the upper left-hand box. That's the launch pad. That's where we have control but no certainty. You could almost think about this as a rock climber halfway up a cliff, where they're not quite sure, am I going to make it back to the comfort zone or peril to my death? And so the launch pad is an environment where we've taken control of something, but we're not sure yet of the outcome. You know, you've hit send on a resume that you've sent out, or all of our investment decisions are made in the upper left-hand box. Whether we're borrowing, lending, investing, it's all a decision that we're making where we don't know the outcome. So those environments are what make up our world. And, a simple experience of flying on a plane may take us through all of them at different moments.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I want to ask you to talk a little bit more also about one insight in your book that I found truly fascinating, which is when you talk about the fact that you're never going to be able to stay in either the comfort zone or the stress center forever. And one of the things you talk about is how when you're in the stress center, you actually, if you had read your book, you would know that you were not going to be in the stress center forever. And that the stress center, like the comfort zone, has its own internal dynamism that means that it will eventually, you'll move into another quadrant. And that was so interesting to me, that we're all living in this sort of dynamic world where we're moving all the time between the quadrants. And for those of you who haven't seen the book, Peter has these great graphs, for example, of an ER doctor and his trajectory through and between the boxes in the course of a day. And his is just covered in sort of scribbles where he goes back and forth from all the different quadrants. Why is it that there is an inevitable end to one's sojourn in each box? Why wouldn't you just stay forever in one of them?
Oh, if we could, suspend animation and just be in the comfort zone all the time, we would do that.
Yeah.
But things happen in our lives that create scarcity, that create vulnerability, and whether we want them to or not, they then shift our position. Sometimes we choose to undertake something new and different. Learning to ski is an activity that'll put us in the launch pad and potentially into the stress center. So we're making choices that move us, or we're being involuntarily moved.
I see.
But I think oftentimes when we are in our worst position, we think it can only get worse from there.
Yes.
And that feeling is actually an indication that we're reaching the low point, that when we can only imagine it getting worse, it's going to get better. It's a very counterintuitive, I sort of joke that panic is God's way of telling us that the worst is behind us, not ahead of us like we think.
Oh, that's so interesting, because that sort of tells us that in a certain way, we're always implicated in our own moves from one quadrant to another, because we're making decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously, that are going to move us around. And I just want to say one thing about skiing. I tried to learn to downhill ski when I was 50, and I can tell you, I was never in the launch pad. I had absolutely no control from the moment I put my skis on and immediately fell over. So I have to say that for me, that was not that experience. But let me ask you also about one of the things that's great about Peter's book is that he has all these sort of real life examples of experiences of being in the stress center, or being in the launch pad, being in the passenger seat. And he gave the example earlier when he was describing the metaphorical passenger seat of the literal passenger seat, when you're sitting on a plane and you have no control over what the plane is going to do. But if you're a certain kind of person, and Peter describes himself as this kind of person, you sit in the passenger seat and you feel completely certain that you're going to arrive, that everything's going to go fine. And Peter describes one journey when he was sitting next to a woman who was absolutely not in the passenger. I mean, she was literally in the passenger seat, but metaphorically, psychologically, she was in the stress center because she hates flying, and so she has a feeling of both low control and low certainty. So I wanted to explore a little bit, what's the intersection between a sort of aggregate feeling of confidence, which is a lot of what you write about. I mean, I found this book very helpful as a manager, for example. What's the relationship between aggregate feelings and individual variation? Because both you and your seatmate were on the same plane, having the same experience, and yet you were not having the same experience. So how do we square variation with aggregation in a situation like the ones you write about?
Yeah, so there are a lot of organizations that do consumer sentiment surveys, the University of Michigan, the Conference Board, Gallup, and they create a composite figure which sort of describes how did America wake up this morning? And there's good and bad to that, because there's that's sort of a composite of all of us, but it is not necessarily indicative of each of
Oh,
us.
yeah.
And so if I look, for example, at economic confidence today, the wealthy feel much better than the poor. These are also being influenced by political identity today, where, if my candidate has just been elected, I feel better than if my candidate lost. And so what I try to do in my work is to think about what is it about the cohort that you're involved in? The organizational confidence that might exist, independent of national confidence. And you can strip it down to an individual level, because often we see that when dramatic things happen, there's a stack to the weight of powerlessness and uncertainty that's impacting people. If I'm short with you, it's probably has nothing to do with you, but the other places in my life where I feel uncertain or powerlessness, that I'm just taking it out on you. And we see this a lot, particularly when groups get together and people have that same shared feeling of vulnerability.
So in a way, I mean, you're talking about individual people's feelings, and you're talking about, a sort of culture of feeling in a larger organizational sense. So, this leads me, I think, to another question that I've been dying to ask you. Most leaders of organizations, whatever size, have to do change management at some point. Exactly, I suppose, for the same reason that you're never going to stay in one quadrant. As a leader, you're really trying to manage people's transitions from one quadrant to another, or organizational transition. And you don't really want your organization to be in the stress center. I mean, you write, very eloquently about organizations in which most people are in the passenger seat, a kind of authoritarian work environment. And then the launch pad, where you've got high control and low certainty, is where entrepreneurial cultures live. Presumably, what managers want to do usually is to at least move their organizational culture out of the stress center. You probably don't want your organization to be there, right? Or would you ever?
So if I'm introducing change into an organization, I need to realize that change equals uncertainty, and for some, change equals a feeling of powerlessness. And so you've disrupted routines and habits and the normal, quote unquote, the normal way of doing things. So anytime you're introducing change, you have to be prepared that some or all of your group will move into the stress center
Right.
for a period of time.
Huh.
And here you need to anticipate that their responses are going to be individualized. Some people may fight you. Some may decide to flee from your organization altogether. Some may quickly follow along and get on board with you. Some may choose to follow somebody else and create an opposing team. And some may just choose to stay there and undermine you. I talk about these as the 5 Fs, fight,
Yes.
flight, freeze, follow, and fuck it. And those are going to be a natural response when you're starting change in an organization. So you need to think about, how do I minimize those feelings of powerlessness? how do I minimize the uncertainty in what we're doing? Can we evolve rather than undertake revolutionary change?
That is really interesting. And so, because I'm trying to do a little bit of this in arts and sciences in William and Mary, and I totally hear what you're saying and I see it. Um, would one change management strategy be to try and shift or guide the culture to evolve in the direction of the launch pad? Like, okay, I don't really know where we're going either, but I'm going to ask you to help me decide, or you to decide. Or do you think it's better to try and get them into some other quadrant than the launch pad? And really, I'm using you as an executive coach here, so I hope you don't mind.
Well, if you think about the education process, we often put people in the passenger seat to give them background and understanding and critical training before we move them into the launch pad. And if you think about medical school, you take classes before we let you start to cut up people. And so you can think about, in a change process, preparing, what's the plan? What's the material that you need to teach people first before you empower them to do it differently? And you also want to help them to realize that you understand that in empowering them, they're likely to make some mistakes.
Yes.
And so you have to be tolerant of their foibles as they do things for the first time that they've never done before. And so they need to see you as a willing coach in that situation, and not someone who's going to be highly critical of them when they fail that first time, which is something that is highly likely to happen because they've never done it before.
Well, and that, the way you talk about that makes me think, you've said it's like education, makes me see a lot of parallels between leadership and management and teaching. In fact, that students do need to be in the passenger seat some of the time and in the launch pad at other times. Are students, is the comfort zone a place where we want our students to end up or not?
So you want them to arrive there and be comfortable leaving it shortly thereafter.
Right.
I sort of view that our responsibility as educators is to take them out of the comfort zone so that they learn and ensure that they have a pathway, or they know the pathway back. And some of that is discovering it on their own through labs and research that they're handling themselves, and sometimes it's giving them the skill set that they need, putting them in the passenger seat. But I think that the more we can empower them to get comfortable in the launch pad, the better off they're going to be in the workplace and the like. I've said to Catherine that if I think about what makes William and Mary unique, as all that undergraduate research and lab work is putting students in the launch pad, and the work we're now doing on internships, again,
Yes.
putting students in the launch pad so that they're much more comfortable in environments where they have to take control in mid-uncertainty.
Yes, no, I mean, that resonates with me a lot, spending so much of my time with students at William and Mary. Is it ever good to be in the stress center?
Yes. In short doses, in moderate doses, what the stress center does is demand focus. And so there are real benefits to having that focus forced upon you. It also helps to clarify what is the problem that has put you there, and to realize that problem solving is finding your way out of the stress center. So I do think that there is value to those experiences. And the other thing I would say, Suzanne, is those recurring experiences build resilience. And so you become familiar with the stress center and you gain skills to get out of it. And we forget a lot that the skills to get out of the stress center are similar, even though the experiences may be vastly different.
Hmm. Hmm. I know what I wanted to ask you. I'm not sure this is totally related to our last question, but I've been wanting to ask anyway. So, I'm very familiar with this phrase, as is everybody, I think, customer satisfaction. So, I took my car to the garage for a service the other day. It was a totally satisfactory experience. It was exactly as, I had expected it to be. And as soon as I was driving away, I got a survey about how satisfying was my experience. I mean, it wasn't really satisfying at all. It just had to be done and it went fine. And so, because customer satisfaction has become such a kind of tired phrase, really, I mean, what does it actually mean to be satisfied by something? I loved your focus on customer confidence and how that's actually a much more significant measure than customer satisfaction. And I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit more, since I mean, your whole book is like one of those books you read it and you're like, of course, why this feels so new, and yet it's got this sort of course feeling to it. Anyway, so just talk a little more about customer confidence.
Yeah. So to your point, we ask people, did you like the experience? But that doesn't necessarily give you any clues as to whether you'd go back.
Right.
And so what I want is something that is forward looking. And ironically, if I ask you, are you confident? Were you confident in that experience? You are inherently looking ahead. If I'm confident, I will do it again. And that repetition really matters if I'm in business. And it also enables me to dig into, how predictable were we? Did we surprise you well or poorly? Did you feel empowered? Did you feel, did we put you in the passenger seat and leave you there, or did we, help to empower you? So it becomes a much more vital measure of the interaction that I've had with you. And the other aspect of it, and this is particularly true in healthcare, is a confident person feels better and gets healthy and didn't feel vulnerable or doesn't feel vulnerable. And I when I'm talking to healthcare professionals, I say that the difference between curing a patient and healing a patient is the restoration of confidence.
Wow.
The elimination of those feelings of vulnerability that you had. And if a patient is more confident, they're going to be less stressed, which means they're going to heal better. They're going to take their medicine more likely. They're going to follow the plan more likely. So there are enormous benefits in business to having confident clients, not just satisfied clients.
And in a healthcare situation, let's say I'm going to the hospital for a procedure. What are the factors in that experience that really can build customer confidence?
So time is one that's critically important. We hate to wait when we're in the stress center. If you've waited for a diagnosis, that waiting period reinforces the feelings of powerlessness and uncertainty. So if we can be cognizant of the time frames and focus on shortening them, or simply being very clear about what that time frame will help keep people out of the deepest part of the stress center. Silly things, signage, messaging, realizing that there are things that we can do in every interaction to reinforce a sense of predictability and a sense of control in those interactions.
And what role does trust play in confidence?
So if I, if I think about it from its etymological, is that,
Yeah.
am I using the word correctly? I mean, confidence is with trust, and so we
Oh,
are
yes.
we require trust to be confident, and what we're realizing is that trust comes from having a sense of certainty and having a sense of control, or if we've ceded control to others, having intense levels of certainty that in order to offset the sense of powerlessness that we have to have extreme certainty. And the airline industry is a great example. That you wouldn't get in an airplane with a 95% chance of arriving at your destination. I mean, the planes cannot fall out of the sky.
I was just, when you said 95% certainty of arriving at your destination, somehow I was expecting you to say on time, and I was going to say, no, 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 Peter, not 95% of them are not on time. But of course, you're talking about them actually getting there. And what's interesting too is that we build up our confidence in the future by going to the past, I think. I mean, many, many times I've heard people say, well, I'm going in for this procedure, but, I've got this surgeon who does these procedures all the time. Like he does, 25 of them, or she does 25 of them every day. And that seems to build people's trust in the surgeon, and therefore confidence, which in that situation cannot be coming from control, since you really cannot control your own surgery. That's coming from a feeling of certainty, because the guy has made it work so many times before. So in that sense, confidence is generated from the past too, right?
Oh yeah, and repetition is a huge generator of confidence in our lives. Anytime we have a first time experience, we shouldn't expect to be confident. A first date, a first, whatever it is, and to just be realistic that confidence comes from the experience of having done something. And again, are you prepared, rehearsed, practiced? All of those are ways that we create the past that you're talking about, that we can then
Yes,
extrapolate into
right.
the future.
That's right. So I wanted to switch gears just a little bit. You and I, when we've talked previously, have talked about the impact of COVID on confidence in, let's say, in America, very low certainty and very low control. And essentially, the guidance, essentially, we were all invited into the passenger seat. Don't do this, you mustn't do that, you won't be safe if you do this and that. And of course, some people rebelled against being in the passenger seat and said, I'm just not going to do what you tell me. I have much more confidence in I mean, I have a neighbor who I love, but I was absolutely gobsmacked one day when, she was, I think it was about the vaccines, was she going to get vaccinated? And she said, well, I have to do my own research first. And I'm like, what, have you got a virology lab in your backyard? But I think that, some people are more temperamentally suited to, or were more temperamentally suited to, the kinds of demands that the culture of COVID made upon us. And I think it's been hard for a lot of people to regain their confidence after living in that stress center for so long. And you and I have talked about this. I mean, what do you see as the sort of, long-term impacts of COVID on confidence in general?
So I think COVID has created a, a vast dispersion of confidence as it relates to the health field,
Yeah.
healthcare, vaccines. There is no single view of right and wrong. And so there's a lot of abstraction, ambiguity, And in an environment where confidence is low, where certainty is low, it invites a possibility that anything can be true. And we've seen that with the vaccine space, and it invites conspiracy theories. One of my frequent papers of my students is to look at eras of conspiracy theories, and what you find is that conspiracy theories tend to swell when consumer confidence is low. There are eras of them where they tend to happen in many things at once, and then they dissipate when confidence rises. And so what I think COVID created was an environment that was ripe for conspiracy theories, and we've seen them across the political spectrum. And these are things that we should just expect. And when confidence is low, we tend to grasp sources that feel most familiar to us. And familiarity trumps expertise in those moments. If I'm not an expert, I'm going to go to somebody that I trust, who may have no expertise in that area, but is just a trusted partner in my life.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes total sense. How do we, you've talked about a dispersion of confidence post-COVID. How can we counteract that? What can we do, for example, to help increase the kind of social confidence that was more widespread before COVID, when people were not afraid of going into each other's houses, and where their habits were not built on fear and a sense of the kind of danger of other people and the rest of the world?
Yeah, if I think about where we are most effective in environments of low certainty, it tends to be where we have identified leaders, community leaders, who are highly respected by a small localized group. And to the extent that you can network with them and answer their questions, they can then be effective ambassadors on your behalf. So the goal is, to have the World Health Organization say something in the environment of COVID is quite useless. It's a very distant, abstract entity that we can easily discount. What we need in those moments of low confidence are local spokespeople who can promote to groups that might otherwise be resistant why a particular action may be beneficial to them. And so it's, rather than voicing from the top, creates strength at the bottom. And in many ways, we saw this in real time during COVID with the way hospitals were managing it. So if you think about the best practices that came out of COVID, they were developed from the bottom up and shared from one hospital nurse to another, or an administrator in one hospital to one in another. So you can see the value of creating networks that are closest to the crisis rather than far away from it.
And as you talk, I can sort of recognize some of the strategies that were really recommended and fairly widely adopted too in management of COVID, particularly vaccine take-up, where people were more receptive to hearing vaccines recommended by their primary care physician than they were, from the CDC or whoever it might be.
I mean, even in your own organization, as you're contemplating change, is to step back and say, who are the influencers, those whose standing in the community may be not reflected in their official position, but whose support would be really helpful to you in achieving the goal that you're trying
Yes.
to set in motion.
Yes, yes, and that seems like absolutely excellent advice. So I think I'm going to take the chance to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up. I study literature, and I'm very, very interested in storytelling and stories, and in narratives, and in the way that we use stories to make sense of the world. So I loved the chapters near the end of your book on storytelling. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of storytelling in the confidence space, in either building confidence or expressing confidence or diminishing it.
Yeah, we talk a lot about, being data driven or being fact driven, and we're not in
Yeah.
reality. We are stories about data driven or stories about fact driven. So the stories have far greater power than the objective information that we otherwise rely on. And those narratives are vital. And more than that, they're reflective of our mood. I love that we now have the technical ability to watch narratives over time. And so we can see that the words we use mirror our mood precisely. And we'll choose specific words based on our level of confidence and consistently. I see this with business leaders, and we see it with crowds, and Google Trends and other tools let us actually chart them and see them. And so stories, I think, are objective information that's worth digesting, worth appreciating, and not to get focused on the objective facts, but what's being said about them.
Mm-hmm.
And because those stories are giving you great insight, not only into how people feel, but then what they're likely to do next. And so if I know the story you're telling yourself, Suzanne, I have a pretty good sense of what you're likely to undertake next in your trajectory.
And how can you figure out? I mean, I suppose people tell you their stories, right? So that's how you figure it out. But I really like the way you use Google Trends to analyze the number of times that the word unprecedented was used in the immediate, right at the beginning of the pandemic when people had no idea what was going on. Um, so so I'm just, you're really talking about understanding people's motivations through their, well, maybe not their motivations, but their orientations, shall we say, where they're going to go through hearing their story. Can you give me, and if you can't, that's fine. Can you give me like one of those real world examples of that? It's a bit like you sitting on the plane, like a time maybe when you've um, interpreted from a story that someone's told you, in what kind of direction might this person go next?
Sure. So I do this frequently in the investment space, because the investment world is filled with stories, and those stories end up on the front page every night, and they're expressing and explaining why did people do what they did and what do they expect to happen next. And so if I watch the stories, if in an investment environment, they go from this is never going to happen to this is absolutely going to happen to this is unstoppable. And the word unstoppable always makes me smile, because if everyone thinks something is unstoppable and have acted on it, it's going to come to a dead stop very quickly.
Why?
Because we believe things are unstoppable,
But they're not.
but they're not. And so that sense of collective overconfidence that something is unstoppable reveals that it's not. We saw that in the 2016 campaign when Time magazine put, can anyone stop Hillary on the front of the magazine? And in my mind, her career was over at that point, because that sense of invincibility is what signals that the crowd has already peaked and is likely to reverse course.
Wow. Gosh. Well, your focus on stories, suggests perhaps that, if you don't want to be an econ major, you should definitely be an English major, because it turns out that, stories are applicable across the board to almost all of our experiences, I think, and certainly also in the corporate and the economic world. Well, thank you so much, Peter. I mean, I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to ask you all the questions that were coming into my head when I was reading and rereading your book. And now I want to just open things up. Isaac, I don't know if you want to be the sort of moderator, how you would like people to participate, raising their electronic hand, question in the chat, just breaking in. How should we do this?
That's great. Why don't we have folks raise their hands and I can invite them to share their questions. So let's open up the floor to questions. Who would like to go first? Please raise your virtual hand, or also feel free to just chime in as well.
And I'm also, so Grace.
Grace.
Hi, hello, Peter. Hello, Suzanne. Hello, Isaac, and everyone here. Really grateful for the lowdown on the details of your book. I confess I have not had the chance to read your book, but the title fascinates me. I'm a data scientist, I'm a statistician. So we talk about confidence a lot. And in fact, in particular, I'm a Bayesian statistician. So it's not even just confidence, but it is posterior confidence. So we call it credibility rather than confidence. The more technical term is credibility. And that totally aligns with what you were saying about, in terms of satisfaction. It's not really satisfaction. It's really the credibility, in the sense of wanting to reuse the service or revisit the the product or whatever it is that we are a consumer of. But having noted that the general public, and honestly a lot of administrators and politicians, lawmakers, they make decisions a lot of times based on the gut, and perhaps making decisions based on the gut is actually a trendy thing because of social media and everything. So the more people can jump on the bandwagon, the more it seems to be well received, and the more it becomes reality. When in fact we know a lot of times gut feelings are often very, very flawed. So you having had this experience writing the book and researching into the materials to write the book and understanding the psychology of people, how do we go about trying to get society to be aware that just going by the gut is actually not the right thing to do, and in fact very dangerous thing to do?
Yeah, so what I've tried to do is to create a framework that allows us to see that where our gut is worst is when we are either overconfident or extremely underconfident. Overconfidence gets a lot of attention, but underconfidence is as damaging to our decision making as anything. And we saw a lot of underconfident decisions being made in the midst of COVID that had longer term consequences. One of the things that we find is that policymakers, particularly successful policymakers, are in the business of mirroring mood. To be elected, particularly over and over and over, requires that they mirror what the crowd wants in terms of their preferences, precisely with the mood of the crowd. What social media has done is to enable more people to express mood more quickly in more places at once and more things. It's a mouthful, but essentially, if I think about what social media has done, it has dramatically shortened the period of time between when I feel something, when I say something, and when I do something. And this is something we can actually see quite clearly in the investment space. And so it creates this image of very volatile responses in politics, in financial markets, in our behavior more broadly, because we're coming together, reaching a consensus far more quickly than we have before, and then acting on that story. So I don't know that I've answered your question, but I think just being aware that gut decision making is moving through the system faster than ever before should give us a reason to pay more attention to where we are in terms of our feelings of certainty and control.
Thank you.
Grace, thank you so much for your question. And Peter, thank you. We still have time for a few more questions. So please, folks, feel free to chime in.
Or comments if something that Peter said resonated with you, or you want to ask, share some experience or thoughts of your own too. I think Peter would be glad to hear that, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Sorry for having some technical difficulties here. Peter, congratulations on the book. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm a big fan of behavioral economics, and your book Moods and Markets expanded that to how the greater universe of people, and this expands it even further, well beyond economics and investment markets that I'm mostly focused on, and into really aspects of everyday life. So it's really fascinating. I don't have a question. I just had an interesting observation. For years here, we've noticed whatever part of the market is doing the worst. It can be emerging markets. It can be a sector. It can be a small cap or a large cap. It can be anything. We've noticed that the biggest returns are made when things go from absolutely terrible to merely bad. And that probably maps to your map, because it's like, well, things are just going to get worse and worse and worse, and they don't. And I guess however, people have discounted their models, and vice versa as well. So I think your book is not only applicable to just about everything in life, but again, it is very, very valuable from an investment manager such as myself. And I just want to applaud you and congratulate you.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. And yeah, going from horrendous to just horrible there's a lot of money to be made, but it takes courage, because those moments feel like you're lighting money on fire.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. Timing is always, you never really know, right? You might know where you are in your quadrants, but it is very informative. It does help narrow down that time frame a little bit better. If you use all the tools at your disposal, I think yours is very valuable.
Thank
you.
You.
If you're a little bit early, if you're right about what quadrant you're in, it's not going to hurt you. You're going to be well served by knowing where you are and position yourself accordingly.
Yep.
So thanks. If I make some better money on this, I will kick back some to William Mary. Believe you me.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments?
Well, I will just join in to say, Peter, this was such a fantastic conversation. And Suzanne, thank you so much for moderating. This has just been so wonderful and eye-opening. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this, but it was fantastic. So thank you both. Just before we wrap up, I just want to share with the audience, anyone has any other questions or comments, feel free. Alrighty then. Well, thank you all so much for joining. The Washington Center is so honored to host you, Peter, and have you, Suzanne. Thank you both. This was delightful. So wishing you all a fantastic evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
all.
much for the opportunity.
I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night. Thank you.